peace on an individual level, mindfulness and meditation, emotional regulation.
They seem very connected. What we notice is there's an energy kind of spike and then a decay that is not a peaceful state. In terms of ice cream, enjoying the feeling of anticipation of ice cream, experiencing ice cream cone while you have it, technically the last desire one lets go of in Buddhism before finding a truly peaceful state is the desire for peace.
Well, I guess that's a great place to introduce and bring on the people who are going to be watching this on the camera. Welcome to this interview, conversation style video. My name is Kenneth Scher and I'm with Reverend
Mathew Fisher. I'm a Shin Buddhist priest in Reno, Nevada, which always sounds like a little bit of a confusing thing, but this temple was started about 32 years ago by my teacher, Daigan Matsunaga, and our point of view in Shin Buddhism is that we live in a universe that cares about us and cares for us in so many ways that we kind of don't justify or deserve, but it still cares about us. And if we can live in gratitude for that, that's enough to have a joyful life. And more wanting and desire and expectation beyond that just leads to suffering. And that's the fundamental idea in Buddhism, is that a joyful life can be experienced wherever you are. You have everything you need to be happy.
Yeah.
It's just kind of up to you whether to see it or not. The Buddha experiences winning and losing with the same joy. So sometimes we differentiate happiness and joy. Happiness is the short, it amps up, you get really happy, and then it kind of melts away, like, getting what you want, getting the ice cream cone. It's short-lived and not real. Joy is a sustained experience of life that is truthfully, like, the positive, wonderful quality of life is just present. I associate that with when you say the word peace.
Yeah.
That if people are at peace with each other, then the challenges of conflict and the destructive aspect of conflict is absent. Really, the way to promote peace is to teach people how to adapt their thinking and say, well, what do they think? Yesterday I went to a breakfast and it was about, there's people who had experience in the government and working in the State Department or the military or something like that, a forum for that. And it was a breakfast about, it's all these retired people. But they still want to be actively engaged and understand the world. So it was about the Ukraine war. And I noticed that every one of the presenters presented how the Ukraine war was going and how the Ukrainians should win and how the Russians were bad. Well, it's not really how you find a thread to peace. The fact is that the Russians wouldn't have gone to the trouble of risking so much blood and treasure if they didn't think it was important. And they probably are afraid of something. Usually, any animal, when it's trapped or cornered, becomes quite vicious. Human beings are the most vicious animal on the planet. So, and the sum total of all the viciousness that has preceded us through our history and development as a species has always been pretty nasty. And the peaceful, friendly ones of us got knocked off in the process. If you're having a Viking melee with the, whatever, with the Vikings, they would have fought the Britons. You're fighting with the Britons. The guy, Lars, who says, well, can we just get along? He gets an axe to the back of the head before he knows what happens. He doesn't have any kids, and therefore his genetic tendencies don't go ahead. But the ones that kept going were the most conflict-oriented, violent, win at all costs. That's what the system, if you're growing rice and you were trying to select for long rice grains, our species has done that for the difficult, violent tendencies. Through all that, though, we have the capacity, and those times are past. So we act like they're now, but they're not now. And we have kind of, in some ways, you can just say collective karma that's, there's sort of a crushing weight of evil karma that's pulling us down there.
And this is where, sorry to interrupt, but I think this is where the tie with finding peace on an individual level or sustainable joy, I said, as you said, it might be described.
Yeah.
Relates to the ability to have, I guess, this frame of mind switch that we talked about. Because it's all, and what allows humans on a broader scale to cooperate and actually choose to have cooperation rather than just select the guy who's being aggressive, where it might be the gift of our language that can allow us to cooperate enough with enough weaker people, enough less aggressive people to topple the aggressive guy, which I feel like there's a good amount of examples of that, where there is the aggressor who's just violent and is, so powerful, can't be overrun, and then people figure out how to team up. And it's
right. I was watching a documentary about chimps the other day, and there was one young male chimp that was very aggressive and giving everybody a hard time. And these two older, wiser, and previously had been dominant chimps, the two males, got together kind of. They tried on their own and it didn't work because the young guy was really strong. But then they got together and they kind of created the circumstance where they could put him in his place and say, look, you can't do this. Now, they don't have language, so they had to bite him and hit him and stuff.
Some other kind of social behavior.
Yeah. But he could see that there were these two who were individually weaker, but in fact, together, they could convince him that it was not skillful to behave in the way he was behaving. And he kind of moped around and then found a new intermediate place in the group.
That's an idea. Cooperation rather than one person trying to instill what they believe, or just be the dictator, be the controller. We can always find more. We can always be more productive, more efficient if we can incorporate another mind into the process, in a sense. Or maybe that might level out at a certain point, and that's why we have to have representatives to talk with us. That gets into political systems. But
in the discussion about the Ukraine war, what I was noticing was that the absence of trying to understand where the other side's coming from. There was even somebody who was from the State Department listing like 6 conditions that the Ukrainians had for finding a peaceful like armistice kind of thing. And all the conditions were non-starting conditions for the Russian side, because if you look from the Russian point of view, they feel as though the world is encroaching around them and that they're in great risk, at peril. So if you're in peril, the first thing you do when you're in peril, if you're standing there with a stick, is not put your stick down. It's hard to talk somebody into that, because if they're frightened and paranoid in the bus station and the guy has a stick and he's poking people, if you come and say, hey, it's okay, put your stick down, that isn't really, you have to convince him he's really okay and give him a cookie and some warm coffee and say, and can we put the stick somewhere else? That kind of that has to be the process, because recognizing, the normal way to resolve this has always been in our 50 million year history to just overpower the person, use more force than them, and you win. The problem is that having established that pattern, you can never win peace. So, there's an old adage, peace through strength. Well, the theory was that if you had strength, like an atomic bomb, that you promised to never use, but you could use it, then people would treat you with respect because you're wicked dangerous if you get cornered. Well, now they've done that, essentially, in Ukraine. That has occurred, and it doesn't seem very safe or peaceful. It seems like the kind of little niggling thing that can blow up into a much bigger, more dangerous thing.
It is a huge problem. We are so quick to generalize who the other is. There's only good and bad. Our team is always the good guy, because it's our team. Who likes to say we're on the bad team? But then people also do say that sometimes. So that's generalizing right there. But as soon as you know, this is my team, you're the aggressor, you're the enemy, you're all that is bad, boom, boom, boom. It could be not true, right? B, we might be getting controlled a little bit too much by our emotions and might overlook some pretty horrible things that are happening on Ukraine's side. Like if Ukraine's just completely innocent everything, but there might even be some nuances, but they are the victim.
Right, if you go back and look into the history, there's a lot of manipulation done by both the Russians and the West of the Ukrainian elections.
Yeah.
Even calling them elections is kind of a stretch. I mean, they're sort of turned out the way that whoever played the chess game right wanted they'd turn out. So characterizing any side as all good is the hallmark of not the truth.
Boom.
There usually are problematic aspects to both sides in any conflict, and kind of owning up to those, understanding those, and understanding that they come from some history. You know, with human beings, it usually has to do with life history. What happened to you as a child? Did you have stable caregiving situations, or were there problems? Was there trauma? And then it goes on into youthful life, and you know, we all have our histories. So people all have stuff. It's true of communities, it's true of individuals. Except understanding that, being able to communicate that at the table is the kind of first step to peace. If you can't say, hey, the reason I attacked you is because I was afraid, then, you know.
And this is where I think everything boils down to: how can we regulate our emotions enough so that we can put the quick reaction of fear, of hate aside, and actually do these things? That's the big question. That's hopefully what I motivate the reader to do. I don't know, you haven't read the book yet. We'll see.
I have it.
But I'm believing, how do I motivate someone to recognize the need for humility, the need to take perspective, that that their biology might almost be playing a trick on them. Their life history is almost playing a trick on you, where you've been shaped to see the world a certain way and to intake certain information, but realizing that's how your life has been, how to, you know, if that realization, what I hope to do is, if this realization that you're this unique individual, how can this motivate the humility to seek out these perspectives and to seek, well, hold on, is Russia all that bad? How can I question everything I've been told, everything I think is good or bad? Can I go back through those? So I guess a question for you is, what's the relationship with Buddhism and mindfulness and regulating your emotions? What's the connection with that? There's a lot, but
the important connection is developing a sense of the observer, so that instead of being in I, me, and my, you can observe I, me, and my doing its thing. That's all the mindfulness techniques are oriented toward, or do that. They create the capability, cultivate the ability in the individual to observe. So if you get into a conflict situation, instead of I am angry, where you've identified as anger, you can say, well, I could kind of feel that anger flowing up. And that's, then the anger is kind of it's not a separate thing, but it's just one of the many aspects of experience.
Yes.
Only if you sit quietly and observe can you really develop that ability. And the normal thing to do is just I am, to identify with. Identification, like you were talking about us and them, is a big part of the problem. That we are actually truly interwoven with everything and everyone. So it's all us. There's no them.
Yep.
The chair, the table, the person. It's all us.
Yeah. Wow.
We're the universe. And seeing that is challenging. Your question does say, how do you start? How do you encourage someone to notice that would be a pleasant way to live? Well, at some point you get so sick of the poison of hatred that you give it up. And there are a lot of ancient stories, but there are also recent examples of folks, you know, getting out of gangs in LA. They just got to the point where, even though they had been tricked by their life experience to see the world in an upside-down way, they pretty much knew it was upside down.
Yeah.
And it's totally messed up to steal people's stuff all the time or harm people. Or,
Yeah.
you know, the conscience is a part of our consciousness. Our consciousness isn't limited to just us. It's interwoven, intertwined with all consciousness. At first, it doesn't seem like that. It seems like I'm a completely autonomous little robot walking around in my little bag of mostly water. But that isn't really true. Everything we are and everything we do and everything we think and everything we say, everything is interwoven. You can't take one piece out. If we took one piece out of the whole universe, it wouldn't exist. It's everything.
It is all. It is thus, right? That's
Right.
the phrase, yeah.
Right.
Okay. And this is why I love the focus of language and psychology and the relationship with mindfulness and having this almost dissociative experience to the thoughts, right?
They're just thoughts.
They're just thoughts.
You can just watch them.
Yeah.
Just watch them go by. You don't have to be inside them, and if it's a thought about breaking somebody's window because they're bad, you can just watch the thought and accept it. I mean, sometimes we have awkward thoughts. They're just thoughts. It's okay. That's different from, well, and then you touched on it, if we try to control them really at all, but too much, the energy of trying to control them is used kind of against us. So you end up just being all pent up and angry in another weird way.
Yeah. I don't know, have you ever heard the psychologist, he's about to become an emeritus professor at UNR, Dr. Stephen Hayes?
Remind me of his work.
So, as a young psychologist, he was a part of the hippie movement. And a lot of his work has kind of carried with that. But he has developed a new theory of human language and consciousness and human language, and applied it to a theory of therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. And the biggest thing, there's multiple things with it, but one of the key stones is this idea you're talking with about almost letting it go, seeing it, letting it go, observing it. And it's very amazing work. He makes the argument of how this is all a language shift that's going on with when you're able to be calm and meditate and see the emotions and all. Even, and this is really interesting, from his younger days in, the hippie town, California area.
Sure, right. Haight-Ashbury or whatever.
Yeah, it's a lot of the ideas from a psychedelic experience are, or at least some ways of priming someone to go into a psychedelic experience of give up, your control, realize that stuff is going to come in, you just observe it, let it happen. It's very similar stuff to I'm not going to say Buddhism as a whole, no, but mindfulness and meditation almost. How would you, I don't know if you've ever, or would want to say if you've ever taken any kind of psychedelics or not, but.
No, not at all. And specifically because of those hippies. When I grew up, I was a little kid in Berkeley in like 1968, so I could tell you hippie stories to make your hair stand on end, mostly about not washing and things like that. But the Buddhist point of view is that foreign substances and the body, they're not going to give you insight. They're just going to scramble the way your mind and brain work. But the idea of letting go of whatever it may be, the expectation, the fear, you can one thing's attraction and repulsion. You can let go of both of those things. That is the fundamental Buddhist path to a joyful life. That how could when people say, well, that's crazy, how could you go to a football game and not root for anybody? Well, I mean, you literally can go to a football game and root for everybody. You can see the patterns, and if they're well executed, you can cheer, and if somebody's kind of breaking the rules, that's not good, and you don't cheer. But if everybody's cooperating to play the game together, and it's a game of conflict, but it has clear rules, and they're just and reasonable, and there's a truth there. If the ball moves, then it's real. If the ball doesn't move, it's not real. We create games because they're simplifications of real life. And though sometimes they can be used for the opposite purpose and make us, and like the Olympics or something. Well, the wonderful idea, the spirit of achievement and sport of the individual is a fundamental Olympic principle. But somehow it gets into this political thing where they're bad and we're good, and they cheat all the time and we're good. We invented cheating. So to say that the Russians are bad because they're doping is just silly. We invented it. We literally figured out how to do it. And Lance Armstrong was a hero until he wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, in the bodybuilding community, he's like, yeah, no, everyone did this was normal, it wasn't really cheating back in the day, it's just kind of, but, yeah, that's.
Right, if everybody's cheating, then it's not cheating. Well, that's sort of true, I guess. You know, if everybody doesn't use the lines on the tennis court, then it's not cheating if you go outside the lines? No, it's just not, it's not the game anymore.
Exactly, it might be more fair because there's no rules for anyone, and if anyone can break the rules, everyone can, but then it's just there's no game.
That degenerates, right, but there is no game.
Yeah.
So having a reasonable structure to have differing views and peacefully communicate them to the other side, even as something as difficult as the abortion question, or divisive, I guess is a better way to say it, has been used to divide us. Probably most people, everything breaks down to a bell curve, and most people have kind of ambivalent feelings. They think there's some circumstance where it's appropriate and some circumstance where it's not, and having the wisdom and discernment to find that is the right thing. And that anybody who's absolutely strident on either side, it seems like a wacko. To most people, that's true.
And it's kind of funny. That's hitting at the key point of what I point out in part of my book. The super loud, super emotional people on the extremes don't represent us. They are all the figureheads talking, but the absolute majority, 60 to 80% of us, are pretty damn similar. Most of us have humility. Most of us have these social skills I talk about in my book. And that's where it's crazy. How do we, because it seems like you only need 2 bad, crazy people to overthrow a whole country. So it's how do we...
Sure, I think Marx said you needed 10% or something like that. But the idea that the vanguard knows what's right and wrong, and they will convince all the dumb little people of the truth, and therefore the justification of the revolution, that's the idea there. To do the opposite is to let's ostracize anyone who's just completely wacky. And just say, look, that's wacky, and my next door neighbor disagrees with me, sort of, but really mostly we kind of agree about most things.
And how are we going to know if we actually do disagree on everything, or if we do agree on most things, which we most likely have a lot of overlap, not complete agreement, there's tons of nuances, we have to actually go talk with them, or at least just put the assumptions aside and say, I don't know, I haven't talked to them. So that's the big part, is going out and talking to the people that you almost hate the most, that you don't want to hear the perspective of.
Right. In Buddhism, we have one meditation that's very useful for this purpose, is a metta meditation. Metta, it means loving kindness. And usually the way we start that meditation is say, feel an energy of loving kindness in your heart, and then flow it to someone you care for. Well, that's pretty easy.
Yeah.
And it could be a 2-legger or a 4-legger. It doesn't really matter. Sometimes people are hard to love, but usually the little cuddly, warm 4-leggers, maybe that's easier. So a little puppy. Okay, everybody can exude loving energy toward a little puppy. And then, okay, we tried that. And then we work on maybe somebody you don't know, just somebody you saw at the coffee shop, and then which we call a neutral person. We try that. Well, that's not that hard. They're probably a person. They probably have challenges. They probably deserve some love and kindness in their life. Okay, so you feel that loving kindness energy in your heart, flow it up through the crown of your head and shower it over that person wherever they are now. And they probably really feel it in a subtle way, even when we just talk about that. If you try it right now, it probably touches that person. They don't quite know what it was, but it touches them. The kind of culmination of the meditation is to pick someone who's difficult, who you're mad at, or you have conflict with, and do the same thing. Feel that loving kindness energy build in your heart, flow it through the crown of your head, and shower it over that person. Now, it's a little bit scary to even imagine a person you're in a terrible conflict with, because they're scary. You've made them into kind of a monster. But in the meditation, it's a safe, constructed space, so they can be there. Okay, so we have this horrible person there. Now, even just being there imaginarily is a very helpful thing to do. And then when you shower them with loving kindness, and the blue loving kindness, energy, that's what I see in my visualization, flows over them, they have a little smile on their face. Well, you've never shared a smile with this person, you hate them.
Yeah.
But now you're looking at them and they're just a person and they're smiling, and they probably had difficulties in their life that probably are part of the reason they're so difficult. The exact causes you don't know, but it's not hard to extrapolate that probably the reason that person was screaming at you in the parking lot was because there's difficult stuff in their life. So just flowing pure love, no strings attached toward that person, helps them.
Yeah.
And it helps you the most, because instead of holding anger and frustration and those unpleasant conflict feelings, and they generate actual poisons in your, cortisol and all those kinds of things inside your body. If you can let that go and just let them have some love in the meditation, it's an imaginary situation. We do it in the meditation hall. That's really, really good for you.
Yeah.
Probably helps them. And ultimately, next time you run into them in the parking lot, it will help them too, because the likelihood of you coming to blows diminishes. Because now you thought, well, okay, I guess I understand. They've got their stuff.
Yeah.
And, the first step is just kind of tolerance, and then you can kind of work toward understanding, and then probably after that you can get to respect, and at some point you can get to love and understanding. Yeah. Of someone who's different.
Oh. And let me break this down for people who think that he's just a Buddhist guy saying some wacky, dumb Eastern stuff. Everything what he just said with the metta practice, with the metta meditation, metta.
Right, yeah.
The idea of starting with something you can do and working incrementally up to the super scary thing that you don't want to do that brings all of these emotional arousal responses out of you. This idea of taking it step by step, something you can easily do to the hardest, this is exactly how we get rid of, or at least help train people to not be so controlled by their fear of snakes, their fear of anything. This is how we treat phobias. It's gradually, step by step, approaching the end goal. This is basic behavior analysis stuff, and this is why meditation, Buddhism, and mindfulness is so incredibly powerful and integrated into the mission and the theme. It doesn't show up too much in the book in words, but hopefully the idea gets across. It's powerful stuff.
Right, and that progression keys off of the fact that our neuroplasticity, for want of a better word, the fact that the way we think about things can change, and it can be gently molded, or we can cultivate, it's a Buddhist word, the wholesome view instead of cultivating the unwholesome view. That's what we try to do in everyday life. In the meditation hall, around this metta meditation, that's specifically what we're doing.
Yeah, and that's kind of it exactly. I was very inspired by my mindfulness and psychology class at UNR, and it was one of the driving forces, or at least points of understanding, that helped me really narrow in what the problem is. And it seems like the big problem in politics, with the lack of cooperation, with the overgeneralization, the hate, the division, sometimes I say it's a lack of social skills, but I feel like more specifically a lack of emotional control in a way. Or at least not control, but
it's the habit and comfort with being in conflict. We had one member that complained to me one time that she didn't she disagreed with someone on Facebook, and their friend said, you weren't upset enough by the bad person. So she was being separated into us and them, not based on agreeing with the bad person or agreeing with her friend. She just didn't agree with her friend stridently enough.
Yeah.
And she was frustrated by that because she didn't really agree with the bad person, but, you know, like the idea to say that Putin's a person too, most people will freak out. They're like, are you kidding?
And this is...
Yeah, but it's a person. It's a person who's been... one of the big things that someone was talking about recently on why this conflict occurred right now is, as the big ruler of Russia, he didn't want to get sick. At first, everybody thought everybody was going to die from COVID. They didn't realize that it wasn't that bad unless you had underlying conditions. At that point, he isolated himself. Well, who did he isolate? He isolated himself with a few people. The few people he isolated himself with tended to not be the people who interacted a lot with the rest of the world. They tended to be the people who didn't, which makes sense because you wouldn't want to go hang out with somebody in a disease environment who goes and hangs out with lots of people. You kind of narrow it down to a few trusted friends. So he ended up isolating himself with the very people that were kind of paranoid and afraid Russia was going to get taken over or overrun, or, you know, NATO was going to come right to its border and threaten them. And he didn't listen to anybody who had like lots of business interests in the rest of Europe, who would lose terribly if there was a big conflict. He only saw those other folks, that narrow view. So neuroplasticity, you know, his world closed in on him to the point where he could behave in a monstrous way, though internally, I'm sure, he thinks that's what he should be doing. I mean, nobody wants to be bad.
Yeah.
He thinks he's protecting Russia.
I mean...
And you see people like that all the time. They're tremendously overbearing and unpleasant at the supermarket. And they're yelling at the clerk because the change was wrong or something. And if somebody says, hey, relax, dude, then he freaks out at them. Well, he's primed because of that habit of mind to be in conflict with everybody, to be overly aggressive like that. Now, it's not necessary. And evolution says that it used to be maybe necessary for us as a species, but it isn't anymore. Yeah. So how can we grow up to the point we can match our physical reality to our mental reality? There's a disconnect, and mindfulness helps reconnect.
And this was a tough thing. Your friend had an experience where she wasn't hateful enough against Putin. Right. I had a situation where I made a joke that someone took very wrong, right?
Okay.
Took the wrong way and basically started thinking I was too insensitive. I was basically complete scum of the earth for a joke.
Because you made a joke.
Because I made a joke. And it's the same idea. It made me even think of an episode on South Park where there's a school shooting at the elementary school, and the mom is so crazy concerned, how, you know, a parent should be. You know, my kids were in the school shooting.
Terrible, frightening.
It's terrible. And then everyone else was like, oh, it's just, you know, the episode plays it off like no one even notices. And then she is insanely mad at everyone else for not caring enough. And then the episode ends by her not caring at all, just like the other people. And it shows, okay, maybe not caring at all isn't good. Caring too much to where you're too... There's, like in Buddhism, there's the middle way.
There's a middle way.
There's the middle way.
Right. And when we touched on the abortion debate, there's some form of middle possible. And really, most states kind of come to that realization that there are circumstances where that seems necessary and circumstances where it seems optional, and maybe we should kind of find, you know, what's the phrase? The phrase everybody seems to agree with. If you do a poll, you can get most people to agree with abortion should be available but not common.
Yes.
Most people in that 80% of the bell curve that you were talking about feel like, yeah, it should be possible when it seems necessary, but most of the time it's not necessary. Yeah. Okay, well, so how do we engineer, or how do we create policy that makes that happen? Yeah. The groups on either end of the spectrum have no interest in that. Yeah. I mean, they literally make money off of, you know, the NGOs or whatever the little groups are called, get donations out of people feeling upset and the kind of strident view.
Most people, the 80% of the bell curve, they can get behind the idea, and even me, where I'm more pro-life than pro-choice. I think abortion is wrong, the murder of I think it's wrong. But for cooperation to even happen, for me to not just say, you know what, no, I'm not moving my ground at all, which most people can. Most people aren't so gung-ho on this one issue.
Invested in it to be intransigent.
It's only most very devout Christians, Catholics, religious people, Jews, Muslims, other religions. And that's not the majority of the population. And that's another thing, it's not 100, if you're religious, you 100% are pro-life. It's Joe Biden says he's Catholic, and now he's,
Sure, Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi didn't seem very bothered by having Roe v. Wade in place, but when it was taken out, they seemed very upset, but then they say they're Catholic. So it can't have to do with the rule of Catholicism in their mind. People are able to juggle lots of different viewpoints, and that's true. If we can find that common, if the people in the middle can somehow, it's hard because the way social media in particular works is only the most strident and adamant people get a voice, and the algorithm promotes that. So, and it pushes everyone like out of the middle into the sides, which is a deformation of the natural bell curve. That's challenging. Finding, well, even in the case of not my favorite topic in the world, but okay, with the abortion debate, it's pretty clear that you can say that when in the old times, in the 50s, when certain states had relaxed rules about it and certain states had very strict rules about it, there was a problem that people still sought out illegal and unsanitary and technically unsound terminations of pregnancies. And that's terrible. So if someone was pro-life, they would see that as terrible. I mean, now if the baby and the mother are dying, well, that's terrible too.
Yeah.
It's necessarily more terrible. Murder is murder, or death is death, and it's
or then even maybe
unnecessary.
Or then maybe, and this is me saying, I don't know their perspective, I'm just going to guess, maybe this is their perspective. They would even see the mother as dying. Someone on this pro-choice spectrum, some might see that if you do die, well then that's your retribution. That's your eye for an eye, your life for a life. And so that's...
Well, but see, doesn't that sound like strangely circular? If that was like the most strident pro-life person would say that the mother deserved to die when she killed her baby, yeah, okay, that's an eye for an eye, and Buddhism doesn't have eye for an eye. The conclusion that if you did that, everybody would just have
a bunch of blind people leading the blind.
Right. That's in terms of justice, which is a difficult word. Mostly it's used to represent revenge.
Yes, that's a big topic I have with prison systems. We're all focused on revenge, retribution, just punishing the person, not in the psychological term of trying to shape behavior, but just being mean back to whoever was mean. And
that's the very ancient sense where it's really punishment, and they made up a word, a correctional facility. Well, the idea was it would sort of correct your aberrant behavior. You couldn't play inside the lines of life's tennis court. You crossed over the lines, and now you need to learn how to stay within the lines. Some other countries are better at it. Now other countries have different cultures, but like German prisons are tremendously successful with not having people go live outside the lines anymore. Now, when you look at you see photographs of a German prison, they tend to look like a motel. Yeah. Like they got like a dresser and this carpet, and each guy has his TV set and on the cell block, and you think, well, they're really in prison? Yeah. And then America's somewhere in between. In Korea, in the winter, they don't even give you a blanket. So you're in the concrete cell there, and you're going to freeze to death unless your family brings you a blanket. So that idea that the society has agreed that if you play outside the lines, you should be not really tortured, but you should be very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And you could get hypothermia.
Yeah.
Now everybody ends up with a blanket somehow, which, lucky for them, I guess. I don't know what happens to people from another country who accidentally get, imprisoned in Korea, because that would be really cold. I mean, I was there in the spring, and it was still very cold, and I can't imagine what it would be like in a correctional facility there. It would be terrible. So different cultures have addressed the problem differently. Now, I don't know, maybe in Korea it's so harsh that people really do say, yeah, and that's never going to happen to me again.
Literally.
I'm going to work and live within the lines, the constraints of society, and not do that.
Yeah. And that is something some people might even disagree with right there is, well, why should we play to your rules and your game, but what about the game that I think is better to play? And basically the kid who throws the Monopoly board, or the person... Right. It's an interesting thing. I make a note.
That's what we call the moral abyss of relativism. If everybody's truth is okay, then the truth of the murderer and Ted Bundy's perfectly fine, and then somebody who's nice and plays by the rules and has they're nice too. You can't have a society like that. That's not how, chimpanzees don't live that way. We can't live that way. Wolves don't live that way. We can't live that way. Bees don't live that way. We can't live that way. The idea that we have language and we make up this crazy idea that everybody's truth is true is a grave error. But it comes from not really looking at the natural world around you and just kind of living in your head. Some philosopher was writing a paper, and so he made this idea up, relativism, and it's just it's a difficult thing to correct for in a society, but
it is an interesting note, because some people do, and even people in my field of behavior analysis, they are pro-relativistic in that sense, where they think, well, everyone's truth really is the truth. But I do kind of hark back at that in my book and say, no, even, like I quote primatologist Robert Sapolsky. He makes the note, we don't want a hurling car going down the street if the brakes are cut. We might know why it's doing it. We can understand it. We don't want it to do it. We as a culture still make the rules. As a culture, we make the game, which is ever changing. But the key is it has to happen with the entirety of the culture, unless, or otherwise, if that doesn't happen, if there's just a radical change by 10 people, by 10%, you're not going to have what I would say as peace, harmonious society.
The French Revolution is the kind of most recent example of, let's just let the radical lunatics on one end of the spectrum go. And what ended up happening, like Robespierre was a big revolutionary in the first year, but then halfway through, by the second year, they'd already killed him because he wasn't revolutionary enough.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And it was terrible for everyone, for regular folks. When society breaks down, economy breaks down, it is not a pleasant circumstance to live through. And no one would wish that on anyone. So even if you think you know how society should run better, that's your little teensy-weensy imaginary truth. The actual truth has to do with the preponderance of experience throughout history, and it's fairly clear. Stable times, people can learn and be productive and share with each other. That's what we're meant for.
Yeah. And I think this gets back to realizing the 80%, the majority is in the middle, right?
Right.
Yes. Man, let me look at what else we've got for today. And also the time, because we do have a little bit of a time constraint. 11:35, okay. So we talked a little bit about what is peace in a Buddhist perspective, and even my perspective. We talked a little bit about finding peace on a personal level, what this means on a Buddhist perspective, how this might carry over into you being able to not control, but somehow regulate, not be controlled by your emotions, which might set you up to be more
We use the word identify with.
Identify with, yes. Yeah. Boom. Yes, that's very similar terminology, almost identical to acceptance and commitment therapy terminology. The link between Buddhism, mindfulness, emotional regulation, and then a little bit of the biggest obstacles obstructing peace. We're thinking it's every single person has every single person contains the biggest obstacles to peace, contains the biggest obstacles to unity. Because at the end of the day, the individual can choose to be either, can choose to listen to either thoughts, the good thoughts or the bad thoughts, relative.
But you said every individual can choose. I think some people are not aware enough to know there's even a choice to be made. There are also people who are so invested with a particular way of speaking, or way of acting, or way of looking at the world, that they feel no choice. And that can happen in positive and negative ways. In a positive way, we're all very constrained. We come to an intersection and the light's red. We could drive right through it, but we don't. Now, that's out of self-preservation interest and understanding the rules of the road, but also you don't harm anyone, so you wouldn't do that. So while free choice sort of exists, there are limitations to what the latitude that the individual has to make those choices.
And I think this is a great point, and I don't know if I do it necessarily in the book, but in my content on YouTube. If we're not aware that the choice is there, then the choice isn't there. The choice might well be there in reality. We can go through this door, but if we don't see that door, if we're not reminded it's there, maybe it's behind this wall that we're just not looking at, but it is an option available to the organism. We just have to be reminded. We have to be almost kind of guided.
It's helpful, and I think that's what religious traditions do. It doesn't really matter what religious tradition you're part of. Our temple is a member of the Northern Nevada Interfaith group, and often I feel more comfortable with those folks, even if they're not, they don't agree with me, they're not other Buddhists, but they're just other people that actually believe reality is real, that we're part of something much bigger than our little self. That's easier to understand and get along with than the relativistic secular person who thinks, oh, my reality and your reality, they're equally of value. Once you start camping on the street and I can't drive around your tent anymore, clearly you've kind of your reality is impinging on the truth. It's not. It's hard.
This is where sorry, but the focus on almost, I don't want to say radical individualism, but something similar to that, where in cooperation, in having a compromise, these social behaviors that we need to do to have a functioning society, functioning government, it is almost a requirement for every side to give up something. You can't have every single thing 100% your way all the time, every time, 100%. Cannot happen.
Right, even if you're the king, you don't.
Yes, because then you're going to have unstable, you might get thrown, you might get assassinated, there might be a coup.
Right.
If we're just complete radical, only care about the individual at all, well, then there's no promoting cooperation. There's no promoting, okay, I got to let this go.
Well, and in those circumstances, only the strong end up getting what they want. So basically, you're back to Lord of the Flies. You just have brute force controlling everything. So that's not useful.
Boom, exactly. Yeah.
Finding a way to impress that idea or show that idea that everybody needs to give a little bit. That's a challenge. It's probably not a challenge with most of the people in the middle.
Exactly.
They're like, yeah, well, that's probably true. It's folks that have identified completely with their strident positions across a political perspective or a spectrum. Those folks, their whole self goes away if they compromise.
Yes.
And there's this weird idea that if you compromise on one thing, then your whole self goes away.
Yeah.
But it wasn't really you anyway. You're just parroting the silly descriptions of a out-of-work philosopher in London from 1895. There's precious little that we can actually choose, other than whether today I will be kind. Something simple like that. We do get to choose that. Now, the circumstances that occur for us, we don't have much choice at all. We're buzzy bees in a big hive, and the hive needs what it needs, and it will happen.
Yeah.
We don't get to decide any of this stuff. But we do have that subtle choice in every moment to choose a skillful path or kindness. Dalai Lama famously said, "My religion is kindness." He didn't really want to explain anything about the technical things in the Abhidhamma or some sutra. That isn't really Buddhism. To him, what Buddhism is it's just a way of being kind as much as you can.
Yeah, this brings me to a point, I might have taken it out of my book, but a psychologist, Aaron Rodgers, I believe, I might be getting the psychologist's name wrong, he had a proponent in his therapy, what is it? Unconditional positive regard. And it's something you find in Buddhism with this loving kindness concept. And it's key to this idea. I mean, it sounds kind of hippy-dippy to just say, love everybody, man, but
well, it also sounds like Jesus.
It also sounds like Jesus, but then when you break it down, there's so much scientific backing to it too, where it's like, man, the message is so simple. It really is to love. That's it. And we talk about the science behind it, maybe religious practices, but at the end of the day, it's choose love. That's it. Every second, you got that choice. Choose love.
Every time the option occurs. And when we stop at a stop sign, we are choosing love.
Yeah, if you don't get in your car after drinking, you are choosing love. If you choose not to drink and drive, you're choosing love. Just a little thing to put out there, because this video of this drunk driver running away from an accident was going over social media recently. Terrible. But I think this is a good place to wrap it up. We're going in for about an hour. I don't know. We'll check it out.
Been a nice conversation.
This has been great. And yeah, I guess great talking.
Thank you.